Hello and welcome to the Celtic Stars YouTube channel. Today's our first chat show. So I'm Liam Kelly. You might have heard my voice from some of the Celtic history podcast episodes that we've put up recently. And I'm delighted to say I'm joined by the editor of the Celtic Star today, David Folds. Welcome, David.
Hi, Liam.
Yeah. Also joined by David Potter, who's written a couple of books for the Celtic Star before.
Welcome.
And also Matt Corr, who likewise has written a couple of books for the Celtic Star as well.
Hi, Liam.
So I start off today speaking to David Folds firstly. I know you've been involved in a few Celtic books over the years. So I just thought I'd begin to tell the listeners and the viewers, what your kind of background with Celtic books has been.
Well, I think the first one we did was the Willie Wallace book. And Willie's out in Australia, and he's a family relation to mine, Willie. And his wife is the sister of my brother-in-law. So it's Olive's wee brother goes to the games with us and comes around here to watch the football and things. And Willie wanted to bring the book out, and it worked on it for a number of years, and he needed a bit of help with it. So in terms of the writing, getting it up to scratch, and came over from Australia. We had a great time walking about Glasgow and places with the European Cup. We were doing all these Waterson sales. There was a day in Falkirk. We thought this is going to be, it was like a Monday afternoon in Falkirk they wanted us to go to, and I'm bringing a Lisbon Lion, the European Cup that Celtic gave us, and this is going to be Falkirk. I mean, it's going to be hostile territory. And we went, big display, loads of Celtic fans turned up, and then this guy came up, this old guy, and he'd played football with Willie at school, and Willie remembered him right away. They were able to talk, but the man was seriously not well. He couldn't eat and things like that, but he knew Willie Wallace was coming, and he wanted to be there, and he wanted to hold on basically to meet Willie again. And the way Willie just dealt with him, and all the Lisbon Lions I got to know, did the book for Tommy Gemmell and Jim Craig and various other ones, and we did one with Davy Hay and Billy McNeil, and Billy was just wonderful, and all these books were all very successful, and ended up starting the Celtic Star in February 2018, and books were always going to be a part of that. So with a long-standing relationship with David Potter, who's probably the finest Celtic historian of all time in my view, and got to know Matt, and ever since then I've not been able to get a word in.
So you've introduced a library of books to the Celtic Star since that was launched in February 2018. So say on one hand you got the website, which has had over 40 million page views now in that short time frame, just under 3 years. What was the thinking behind a library of books as such? Because a lot of other fan media websites don't necessarily have books, whereas we're quite unique in that way that we've got quite a few of them. Was it something that you always thought was important, or just something that you enjoyed doing?
Well, the Celtic Star's sort of the kind of Celtic site that I would want to read, and it's not full of clickbait, and it's got a lot of quite serious stuff on it. We've tried to go across the generations. I mean, if you look at the people on this, this conversation, David can tell you about the 60s, and Matt can tell you about the 40s and 30s. And I think that's important. We've got to have a site that is high enough quality that it's going to be influential, and it can lead issues but also can record our history in a way that we want it recorded. And Invincible, I mean, what's incredible about Invincible was the amount of guys. We talk about our Lisbon Lions there, and obviously every one of them was, Bertie was just wonderful. We used to do this thing with Bertie where he would say, I'll come and sign you the book, right? And said, you give me a wee something. So I ended up giving Bertie £1 and he would come and sign every book. And they would always sell you a book, fly out the door with Bertie. But what was always funny is he would work out his petrol. So you owe me £200, and it'd be £206.45. What's the £6.45? That's my petrol. So he'd always said what his petrol was going to be, and it was hilarious. But on Invincible, what started to happen was the number of players or their families who were buying that book for, quite a few of the guys that played in that team that are on that cover. I'm looking at one now, and got that book for his Christmas last year from his dad. Wives of people who are now at Leicester City bought a big box of them as souvenirs. And that's because it's important. That's a book that people will remember and talk about in terms of, that period. And I mean, I didn't know much about Alec McNair, and, I've been doing this for quite a while, and I knew of Alec McNair, but I didn't know the extent until David's book. And if you read that book and you think, this guy, he's up there with Billy McNeil, he's up there with Scott Brown, and he's like an absolute legend of our club, totally underrated. And that's what the value in what a David Potter book brings to it, And if David Potter says, the first book I worked on with David was Charlie Gallagher, and got to know Charlie and his wife well, and they did a wee holiday out of the book, which they were delighted in, and Charlie was just a lovely guy, absolutely great guy, and once you do these things and you start, it just entwines you in the Celtic story, and then all you guys go off and you bring things to it. When Matt was writing about the 1930s, I just thought it was fascinating, and absolutely the Gordon Strachan years. It's like the guy is sort of he gets such a hard time from the Celtic support, and thinking back on the football, it wasn't always that great, but the guy was brought in, told to, cut his cloth. He won 3 titles out of 4 and was unlucky another one. He was punching well above his weight in the Champions League. There's a book in that.
I remember that, when I was growing up, the first memories I have of Celtic was the Martin O'Neill team. So I remember I hated Strachan when he came in, because I thought, why is he getting rid of Sutton, Petrov? Larsson had obviously gone just before. He's saying he's taken apart this team and replacing them with guys like, who's this Adam Virgo and Paul Telfer that had played for Bournemouth and stuff. And you're thinking, what's going on here? And obviously that's because I had no understanding of the way that the finances were getting, wider and wider between us and the richer leagues. And then when you look at what he had to work with and the overhaul of players to begin with, how he managed to win like 3 titles in a row, and the main thing is, getting to the last 16 of the Champions League twice and beating, the likes of AC Milan. When I looked at their lineup, it was like Dida, Cafu, Seedorf, Inzaghi. They were all, like Kaka, and you're looking at it. I think it was Lee Naylor was left back for us, like McManus. I'm not saying that they were necessarily bad players, but they're obviously nowhere near the level of that Milan team. And we even were unlucky to get beaten in extra time in the San Siro as well. So, yeah. I mean, it was, when you look back on it now, I think he'd done a really good job for, coming in at a really hard time as well. To say, although I was young thinking what's going on, I think quite a lot of Celtic fans on the back of O'Neill were probably, critical of Strachan as well for similar reasons. And they said we didn't have necessarily as nice football as what we had. when you had Sutton, Hartson, Larson, Petrov, and Thompson, players like that to choose from. But then, say he bought a bit of flair with Nakamura, and he still managed to be successful at the highest level with half the players at his disposal as what O'Neill had. You mentioned Invincible book. I was going to start with Walfrid and the Bould Bhoys, but I'll go to the Invincible one first. You see, this is the front cover of the book here. It's in hardback. With Rogic celebrating as he clenches it on the back cover. So I'd go to Matt about this book. So obviously you wrote it, but David mentions that some of the players that were involved in that whole achievement and that Invincible treble winning team, they'd bought copies, and certain people at Leicester that had been involved with Celtic have bought copies. But the foreword was written by Eric Sviatchenko as well. So, how did that come about?
Yeah, that's a good question, Liam. I think almost by accident we'd been looking at a number of options to do the foreword. Some of the guys that were involved, and I think Eric was on social media at the same time, and purely flying a wee bit of a kite, I wrote to him to ask whether how he'd be involved, how keen would he be to be involved with the book. Talking a wee bit about his time with Celtic and his family's time in Scotland, and it couldn't have been nicer. I noticed actually he was on social media just within the last couple of days again, saying similar things. So really by chance, asked the question. Eric came back, said that would be fine, set it up similar to this idea on some Zoom calls, because obviously the pandemic had kicked in. If memory serves me right, had a couple of conversations with him, pulled that together into an interview, ran it past him, and he was delighted to be involved. And indeed, he asked for some copies of the books to be sent. So there's copies of Invincible floating around in Denmark and in Jutland at the moment. So yeah, lovely big guy.
Well, I seen even yesterday.
Gentlemen, can I interrupt for a minute? I'm not getting a very good reception, so I'm going to move to another room. But just keep talking. I'm going to move to another room so we can get a better reception. I'm not hearing you all very well. It's cutting out. Okay.
Okay. No worries. Yep.
Talking among yourselves. I'm listening.
I saw yesterday that Sviatchenko was saying that he'd love to come back to Celtic. He's even talking about that still when he's been gone for a couple of years now. Yeah. So what was it that made you? Because obviously, I know you're really into your Celtic history. Looking kind of back, like you said, you've written about stuff in the 30s and these different early sort of eras of the club. So how come you decided to write about something that was so recent?
Well, again, talking to David, with a number of different thoughts on the go at that time. He's touched on one or two of them earlier, and a lot of this is about timing and I guess a feeling of what feels right. The Invincible's a bit of a hybrid book, so very much talks about the Invincible season, which I think people will only truly appreciate Invincible in that season further down the line. And in many ways, and David agrees, in many ways though, we could possibly accuse of being too soon with that. But I think the Invincible was a special season. If you think about the number of fabulous Celtic teams over 130 years, number of players that's played in the colours, the teams that Jock Stein had, for example, none of them managed to achieve what that Brendan Rodgers team did. I believe it's truly unique. So part of that was capturing that essence, and maybe a slightly different take on it, capturing that season from the context of I guess a dad, a supporter, going with his kids, and also allowing us the opportunity to reminisce and link back to my own childhood as a Celtic supporter. So the idea was trying to put the Celtic supporter in the middle of the book, so that although I guess it's Matt Corr's memories of such and such that David could relate to, self could relate to it, my own kids could relate to it. So it felt right. With a number of options, a number of things that we looked at, but Invincible at that particular moment in time just felt right. I guess that's the best answer I can give you.
Yeah, because I mean, for me, we've got a family friend in his late 70s that grew up watching the Lisbon Lions. He'd met his girlfriend at the time, went on to be his wife. He met her, and her birthday, I think she was like 19 or something at the on the day of the European Cup final in '67, and he always says about that night. And I was just thinking, I always used to think how amazing it must be to see Celtic not just win the European Cup, but imagine seeing the team winning 9 leagues in a row. And then when it was actually happening in our time, I couldn't believe. But towards the end, I couldn't believe it. But as it was happening, when it was getting 5, 6, 7, I was just thinking, well, we're favourites to win the league, and sort of expecting it and not taking the step back and really appreciating that in another 50 to 100 years' time, this is going to be, the future generations. It's going to be like their Lisbon, something.
I think that particular achievement of the 4 years of winning absolutely everything. I mean, I don't think that's ever been paralleled any place in world history. Am I right in saying that? I mean, and I don't think it ever will. I don't think it'll be paralleled in Scottish history, certainly. I really don't.
Yeah, I've said this ever since the quadruple treble was done, and I know people think I'm only saying it because we didn't win 10 in a row, but as a sporting achievement, winning 4 trebles on the bounce and that many one-off games going undefeated, that's actually better than, to me, it's a far better, far harder achievement than winning even 9 in a row, let alone the 10 in a row. I know that obviously a lot of supporters, for them it was all about getting the 10, but say that quadruple treble was something that nothing will ever come close domestically to being done like that anywhere in the world, I don't think. I mean, a 69 game unbeaten run and an invincible treble on top of that.
Incredible.
So I'll come to you next then, David Potter. We spoke before about the Alec McNair book that you wrote. I've done an interview which is up on the Celtic Star YouTube channel. I've got a copy of it here. If anyone wants to see it, this is the hardback, the front cover here, and here, picture of his cap on the reverse. So, as David Folds had mentioned earlier on, he's up there. Alec McNair's up there with Billy McNeill. He's a club legend that won so many things with Celtic. Was like a stalwart figure, and yet for a lot of people, certainly of my age and below, they might not have heard of him or might not be aware of him. So I know you've done a lot of Celtic books, about the likes of players like Jimmy McMenemy and Jimmy Delaney, and going right back throughout the kind of whole history of the club. Yeah. So what led you to decide on Alec McNair?
I think that I just felt that Alec McNair needed to be talked about, and it just so happened that I met David Folds one day at the Kincardine service station, where I think I was picking up some the Walfrid books, and I just thought, here, Alec McNair lived no far away from here. I think we'll try him next. And it was almost as sort of a quixotic decision as all that. But thinking about it, I really felt that there was dangers that Alec McNair would not be well known about. And the reason, of course, was obviously it's a long time ago. It's 100 years ago. That's a long time. But also the fact that because he was in the right back position, which is not a spectacular position in a football team, unlike Jimmy McGrory and Jimmy Quinn, who scored goals, and Henrik Larsson scored goals and so on, or even a goalkeeper who saved loads of penalty kicks and loads of games that he saved. A right back is actually a rather unspectacular position. And but because Alec McNair played so long for Celtic, with the First World War in the middle of it, I just felt that something had to be done about him, because there was a great danger that nobody would know who he was. I mean, can I ask you, how much did you know about Alec McNair before I got involved in it, Liam?
The only thing I knew about him was in the context of Shaw, McNair and Dodds for the Holy Trinity. And I just knew that he was like an iconic figure, but I couldn't really give you much detail as to why. Because like you say, I knew about Jimmy Quinn, like the Dukes, Andy McMahon. the goal scorers and the ones that that maybe they scored a hat trick or something to win a Scottish Cup, that type of thing. So I knew of him, but not great detail about him. And then I done a little bit of research before I interviewed you when we done that sort of hour-long interview about the book. So I found out a bit more then, and then when the book arrived, I found out a lot more and a lot about the social context of that time as well, and a lot about him away from the pitch, because he had a lot of tragedy and a lot of difficulties. So one of the books that we were all involved in with the Celtic Star is Walfrid and the Bould Bhoys. Let's see a copy of it here. Walfrid's statue on the back. And that book was obviously voted into the Scotsman newspaper's best sports books of 2020. It's sold out now on the Celtic Star, but it will be available soon on Kindle or ebook. So I'll start off firstly with this one, because each of us had a section that we wrote. So my section covered the founding fathers of Celtic, and the sort of inspiration for me to write that was I was conscious that I think with Celtic fans, more than probably any other club, certainly in my experience, they know a lot more about their history to a certain point. So I think if you asked a lot of supporters who founded their club and why, and asked anything about going back 100+ years, they wouldn't have much of an idea. Whereas with Celtic, nearly everyone knows the story of the basic story of Brother Walfrid being involved in the founding and a club being started for the Irish community primarily, and to raise funds for the poor. But what they didn't know is that there's several other people that were involved in the founding of the club. And so at first I started to write about John Glass, because he was one of the main sort of contributors to Celtic, sort of particularly once they were established, actually going on to become a successful club, and having a stadium and attracting star players. So that was the first thing I wanted to do, was write about him. And then I spoke to David Folds, and we sort of started to run a bit of a series on each of the founders, and then put them together into a collection. My main sort of passion was to get these people better recognition and to tell their story, and then that would give you a better idea as to the more in-depth details behind Celtic's founding. Because as I say, most fans understand Walfrid was involved, and that it was primarily with Irish immigrants and their descendants that were in need, sort of in the Catholic parishes of the East End. But obviously it goes a lot more in depth than that. And interestingly as well, not all of the founding fathers came from an Irish background, although most did. So that was my section. And then if I go over to Matt, because you wrote the next section, which you can tell the viewers about.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, just before I do, Liam, I think one of the fascinating things, David touched about Invincible and some of the families of Invincible, excuse me, that were interested in the book. Even more so, in my opinion, was what that unearthed for Walfrid. So, great grandfathers, great uncles, or whatever. All of a sudden, when we started talking about the book, we had, with MPs, with folk who could go back several generations and generally wanted to know the story. I loved that about the history. It wasn't just, generally aimed at Celtic supporters. There was a number of people to whom these guys, similar with Alec McNair, and indeed possibly all the books we're talking about, it's actually provided a bit more context even for the families of those involved. So I thought that was really nice. In terms of my own piece for Walfrid, that was very much a step-by-step walk through Celtic's first season, and a bit like the Alec McNair book, I talked about it being the greatest story never told. I don't think it was folk and how folk could tell you Brother Walfrid had founded Celtic, but possibly not some of the other fathers. If you ask folk who Celtic played the first game against, or maybe who scored the first goal, they could probably tell you. Well, they can, because we ask that question often in the tours. But I don't think folk realise that Celtic's first season they reached the Scottish Cup final. I mean, quite an incredible achievement. So clubs like, you know, Queen's Park had been going since 1867. They'd been monopolising the cup. These clubs were long established, and then along comes the Irishman, the Irish club, the East End of Glasgow, formed, as you say, for all the right reasons. That team pulled together, a bit like Angie this year. That team pulled together over a couple of months to start the season, reached the Scottish Cup final, and in some many views of the day, they were actually unlucky to lose the snow final against Third Lanark. Well, the Third Lanarkshire Rifle Volunteers they were at that time. Also, the fact in the first season, so Celtic were in a cup final by August, within 3 months of playing a game. They were in a cup final. Lots of hostility around them because of the background, which is another theme I found really interesting. We dug back. So we had that final against Cowlairs and Kelvin Grove in August. We then had the Scottish Cup final in the February of 1889, and then by May, within a year of playing the first game, we'd won the first trophy, the Glasgow North Eastern Cup, which obviously long since obsolete. At that time, clubs like Clyde, you know, Cowlairs themselves, established clubs. Celtic were up against these teams, and having lost to Cowlairs back in August, and as I say, in the Glasgow Exhibition Cup final, they then beat Cowlairs 6-1 at Clyde's ground, the original Barrowfield Park, to win their first trophy. So I don't think that's widely known. And you mentioned there, Celtic fans like their history like no other. It was great to actually take that step by and see how, you know, pulling a team together, playing a few friendly games, then all of a sudden into tournament football, into the Scottish Cup against these established sides. And Celtic, my view is, since the very, very first season, Celtic's been setting records and setting precedents and beating the opposition against all sorts of hostility. I think that's a magical story.
And then following on from that whole section, David Potter, you wrote the third section of the book, which was about the early star players. I know I initially emailed you about writing about these star players, seeing if you'd be interested, and within about 4 hours, you'd already sent the first article through about one of them. So how did you sort of decide on those star players, and you know, tell the viewers a bit more about that section?
I don't know how I decided. They just sort of seemed to come to me, as it were. You know, I just sort of I think the thinking behind most of what I was writing was the general thing along the lines that Matt was saying about how it was important, I think, for Celtic to be successful and also to adapt to a very large extent into Scottish culture. Yes, they were opposed by you know, all sorts of influences, there's no doubt about that, but the way to deal with that is not to become insular and defensive and have a sort of ghetto mentality about it. The idea, the best thing is to involve yourself, and even as they try to take over Scottish football, which it seems to me that the building, for example, of the new Celtic Park was very much an idea to take over the Scottish football, in the sense that they'd be able to host the Scotland-England internationals, which were big things in these days. But to get back to your point about the players, there are some that just speak to you. You know, people like Sandy McMahon and Dan Doyle and Jimmy Quinn and people like that. I mean, you just can't ignore them. I mean, because they've had such a great influence on the team, and they were so idolised and worshipped in their day that they're very important. And of course, they were all very, very good players. I mean, the record of the club of its first 20 years is absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean, I know Jimmy Quinn's probably your favourite. So when we do another chat show about the pre-Lisbon team, I'm fearing for my safety if I don't include him. So I come to David Folsius lastly on this, because you kind of brought everything together on the Walfrid book and was quite involved with it as well. So, I mean, how did you feel that like these three sections could all slot well together?
Well, I mean, your section, Liam, was really interesting, but it wasn't long enough to be a book. And so in order to, what we did is we talked about it, and we thought, well, David Potter will give us the players, he'll tell us the players, And then Matt had done the job of going through the season, the Invincible season. So we thought, get Matt to do that for the first season in the sort of the same way and give it the same kind of treatment. And I know he was at some of the games with David. And I think that was bringing the 3/3 together on it was, and it became a type of book that, you know, there's been other books, strong, well-written books, really in depth, and you know, we find this in the Celtic Star. You write an article and it's 600 words and it'll get 6,000 people. You write an article 6,000 words and it'll get 600 people reading it. So, you know, if you want the full history of that period, you know, like Brendan Sweeney's early years, fantastic book. But for the people to come in, for the support to come in and find out enough about it in a book and know about the players and about how it started, the games, as Matt was talking about, and all the stories about the founding fathers, is just, you know, and the theme about all these books and everyone, even today, I helped the boy Jerry from Fife, who went to Lisbon on a fiver.
Yeah,
And I think David helped on that book as well.
Jerry.
And he self-published it, and he basically had a fiver.
That's a fascinating story.
And he ended up going to Lisbon there and back, and he had £5. And he took some different people with him. Now, this morning, a guy who was in that car with him, who's not seen since 1967, got in touch with me, and I put the two of them together again. That was just today. And you've had McNair's family have got in touch with us, as you know, David, and I put them on to you. And all these type of things that will just really intertwines the whole story and brings the whole thing to life. And, you know, Matt did the interview with the MP, and he was very proud of the fact that his grandfather was a founding father. And what was his great-grandfather?
Great-grandfather.
Yeah. And, you know, these are other guys who are on, Celtic guys on Twitter, who came forward and said, by the way, he's my great-grandfather, my great-uncle or whatever. And then they were giving us other stories. And so loads of things emerge from doing these things, which, you know, often ends up, the Celtic Wiki guys will pick up on it. And it gets the whole story out there. What you've got to remember is that in the early days, there was no way of other than word of mouth. And even the papers who were hostile towards Celtic, even in those days, and, you know, there was no coverage other than the fans talking. The first fanzine the first fan media for any club was the Shamrock. And that became so powerful that Celtic thought, we need to do something about this. And they started the Celtic View, which was the first club newspaper. And that started because the Shamrock were saying, oh, Bobby Murdoch shouldn't be playing there, he should be playing somewhere else. And Celtic didn't like this. And of course they were right. And so it's fascinating and the guy, the son of the chap who set up the Shamrock was writing for the Celtic Star recently. In the last few years, he's been doing stuff, giving us fascinating stories and coming out. And I think I just love that. I think that's great. I think that Walfrid book in particular brought so much together. And I think that's the success of it. It's just no copies. I've got one copy because it was slightly damaged. It's the only one I've got that's here. I don't think Matt's got any. It's totally gone.
I think the thing I liked about it is when I've done books myself, particularly the first one that I've done, I was proud just to see, you know, a book published with my name on it. But then the thing I like about this one is the fact that I've, you know, been able to do it with other Celtic historians as well. You know, particularly with people with the reputation of Matt and David. So that was something that was really nice to do, as well as having, you know, books that I've written myself to do it alongside others. And then
what you've got to remember, Liam, is that, you know, your generation, you've got to take this on. You know, you'll be the old guy sitting there in so many years when we'll not be around, and you'll be telling the Celtic stories. So it's got to get passed from David and Matt. And
we'll expect that. Yes.
Yeah,
On it goes.
I'll try and get some others involved. I've got say Michael that did the Walfrid PhD. He's a
Yes.
similar age to me as well. So we've got a couple of guys in their 20s that are taking it on board. So hopefully I'll pass it on to other people.
And apparently Matt's going to be a reality TV star. Did you made his debut last night? Did anybody see it?
Who's just
I
You know,
wonder if you're good with that.
Sorry, you're beyond. I didn't get this one.
Matt appeared on television last night.
Did you really?
I did. Sadly, I've got a good face for radio, David. Yeah.
All right.
The Sky cameras honed in on the Celtics.
So what did you actually
I
see on television?
thought I'd seen you before. Wasn't that just before kickoff?
It's myself. I was at the game. The next thing the phone starts beeping, and there must have been about 10 different messages saying TV star or whatever. And I'm thinking, what's going on?
You had a hat on though, didn't you? So I wasn't 100% that it was you. But I said to my dad, I said, I'm sure that looks like Matt.
It's quite uncanny. So obviously in this section, we were something like 3 rows from the back of the stand, and it was myself and my 3 kids. And I said, I still don't know how on earth the camera managed to pick us out from the pitch side, 3 rows for the back of the stand, and ignore everyone else. It was a picture of me and my 3 kids. Quite bizarre. So there you are. So yeah, a TV career beckons, Leo.
Right. Well, more importantly for your life in front of camera, you can talk next about the Harry Hood biography that you've just brought out. So this is a massive book. Here's the front and back covers. As I say, I interviewed you before about this in another sort of hour-long episode, which is up on the channel as well, so people can listen to that for a bit more information. But I'd ask you, so why Harry Hood? Was he a favourite player of yours, or was there another kind of reason behind that?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is that Harry was a local boy. So when I was growing up in Springburn and going to the matches and supporters bus, I guess Harry Hood was the kid who had made good. So he was a boy from Ballarnock who played for Celtic. So couldn't quite get my head around that. I'd be maybe 9 or 10 at that time. And all the men in the bus were talking about how they'd been at school with Harry, or it was the next door neighbour, or the dad was a milkman. So there was always a wee bit, I guess, a fascination about Harry. How the book came around was again a wee bit more accident design, perhaps. We did a piece on the anniversary of Harry's hat trick against the Rangers at Hampden back in '73, and as David would allude to, the Matt Corr 2-part series on Harry's goal. I think when I'd got to episode 11 of the 2-part series, we realised there might be something in this. Harry's family, 1 or 2 members of Harry's family on social media, contacted and asked if they could maybe have a paper copy for family abroad. And it sort of got for there, a throwaway line saying, is there a book in this? And then obviously, certain sensitivities, Harry had only been gone a couple of years. So with a chat with the family to say, look, A, is this something you'd like to do? And B, do you want to be involved in it? What sort of scope? And it sort of went from there, a call like this, just to say, here's what I'm looking to do, tell the story, but not just Harry's 7 years as a Celtic player, because he didn't magically appear on a Celtic strip at 24. It's more to say, well, if I'm doing a biography of Harry, then I sort of need to go back a wee bit. And again, as David alluded to, you get carried away. The book became twice as good. David calls it twice as long. But went back into I managed to tie, I guess, Harry's family, his early beginnings to the early beginnings of Celtic. So Harry's grandfather, getting married on the day there was a big Celtic match going on, and what the Irish contingent and the Gorbals were doing. And then we looked at where did his mother come from. I knew Harry's mum was from the Highlands, so we looked at that completely different background. It was from a wee free background up in near Ross County's ground, up in Dingwall, up in that way. So started doing research, thought Harry's family, wonderful story there. Harry's older brother played for Everton. He was a professional footballer. Both of his older sisters that had survived were professional ice skaters who toured all over the UK and continental Europe, then married US servicemen, met the president in the White House. It was a fascinating story even before you got to Harry. So that's one of the reasons that the book is slightly longer. The other one's probably me. But it's a wonderful story. And then you start talking about Harry's football career, because he was playing for local teams round about. He played for some teams that I would later play for. So there was I guess there was a local connection there. There was a Celtic connection. It was a fascinating story. The family were keen, and all these ingredients sort of came together. And all of a sudden, with a serious project, which was a year's work. Again, not the original intention, but that's to do the story justice for Harry and for his family. Then that's what it took, and that's how the book is, as you see. So real labour of love. Delighted I'd done it. Took a lot longer than I thought, and the family are happy, and it's doing well. So it's, yeah, very, very proud of that one.
What was the story about John Paul Taylor's dad?
Yes. So John Paul. So it's fascinating the things that you go in, the things that you find out. So I knew that Harry played for St Roch's, and so had Jackie Hood. So I went up to meet the folk for St Roch's. They were wonderful. Into looking at the records and everything else. Started looking at the old Evening Times. DP will know, fabulous coverage of juniors all the way through. So you then start looking at the teams, and then I start to say, do you know who that is? That back row. That's John Taylor. His son's the SLO at Celtic. Brilliant. Who's at right back? Jock McStay. You might know him better as Paul and Willie's dad. So it's just quite incredible. Frank Brogan had played there, and Frank passed away around about the same time from memory during the course of the book. So when you start digging back, then you would get stories about how Jimmy McGrory and the entire Celtic team turned up at Provan Mill Park, as it was then, to watch a junior cup tie where Frank Brogan was playing, and Frank was signed just after that. So the story is Harry Hood, but when you start digging into the background, it's omega-3. It goes everywhere, and pulls out all these fascinating stories that link, as David mentioned. You've got the Celtic SLO. You've got a wonderful Celtic captain who, in turn, is related to two Celtic greats from the 1920s, the family McStay, and it's all in the one story. I find it fascinating.
I think the Harry Hood idea as well is that, say, that's like a golden era in Celtic's history, and because that's still recent enough, it was all obviously caught on camera and everything. So for the guys of my age and even like up to my dad's age that maybe have faint memories of it, you can relate to it a lot more, because it's you can go on YouTube and see the videos of some of the goals scored. And but the big thing about that book for me is that I've got the likes of Kenny Dalglish, Lou Macari. These players maybe are like the more famous names, because they've gone on to Liverpool and Manchester United, and Dalglish was one of our best ever strikers, but Harry Hood was like an exceptional player for us, and so the fact that he not had a book out about him, it was good to make sure that his name and his story gets the attention that it kind of deserves for his role in that whole era. And I know you spoke to a lot of the other players like Kenny Dalglish as well that spoke well of him and gave an insight into the dressing room and into the club at that time, which everyone knows about Lisbon, and then pretty much everyone knows as well about the Quality Street Gang and those kind of subsequent years when in my opinion, we should have won at least another European Cup, really. So it's good to get like a window into that time, and to also make sure that a key player that's maybe not as much of a household name to others outside of Celtic are recognised, like Harry Hood, because he's well known within Celtic circles, but it's important that he's kind of recognised beyond that as well for the player that he was. But I'll move on now. So the books we covered today, the Walfrid books no longer available. That will be coming out hopefully soon as an ebook or Kindle version. But the other three books, the Harry Hood book, Invincibles, and Alec McNair, they're all available on CelticStarBooks.com. We do have a couple of projects that are coming up. So one's, I'm hoping it will be out sort of later this year by the summertime. That's Celtic in the Second World War, which I'm writing. So a bit of the background into that was that I was speaking to Brendan Sweeney, who wrote the early years books, and Celtic, the Battle for the Club's Soul. And he said that it would be great if someone that was a bit younger than him wrote about a sort of a period from the club's history that hasn't been covered in as much detail. So he obviously took that idea with his early years books, and he's gone into forensic detail on that period. So I thought from that, what could I write about? So I was thinking initially about doing something on the Kelly kids and doing about the 50s, because that always fascinates me how, a team with the likes of, Mockin, Fallon, Tully, Peacock, Evans, Willie Fernie, how did these guys not win more trophies and, not win more league titles? But in the end, I actually decided I'd go with the World War II period, because it's probably the least covered of any sort of era in our history. And I knew that there was regionalised leagues and that football had gone unofficial for that time. But I thought there must be, good stories in there, whether it's on the pitch or off the pitch. So I thought, I'm going to go ahead with that. Done some initial research, and then I quite quickly realised that there was a lot of content and it would be of interest. So I made a couple of notes here of a couple of things that I unearthed. So one of them is that Celtic turned down the services of Matt Busby as a player, and he went to Hibs. And then you see Hibs end up coming second in the Southern League, as it was then, behind Rangers. And Matt Busby wasn't, well, he was one who actually wanted to sign for us, and we turned him down. But other guest players that were kind of superstars at the time, which we could have got because they played for nearby teams, and we never pursued, was the likes of Stanley Matthews, who played for Morton, Bill Shankly, that went on to become a famous manager with Liverpool, Jimmy Caskey, who was at Everton, I think, at the time. He guested for Hibs, and Tommy Lawton as well, that was an England forward as well. So I've got that. Then I've got things off the pitch, the likes of James Stokes, that was a Celtic fan that won the Victoria Cross. So a lot of Celtic fans will know of the James Stokes Supporters Club in the Gorbals. So he was a local to the Gorbals, say a Celtic supporter, and he won the Victoria Cross for, effectively, he took on a suicide mission for himself to save the rest of his sort of platoon. He was shot a number of times, but kept on going to protect his fellow soldiers before obviously he finally couldn't go anymore. So that whole story is covered in detail. You've got major events like Willie Maley leaving the club, and the kind of controversy surrounding that and what an impact that had on the club. Then there's things like the original flag issue. So everyone knows about the flag controversy in the 50s, but that had actually started in 1940. There's references to the SFA trying to get the flag taken down from Celtic Park, the Irish tricolour. There's things, well, John Divers, that was quite a standout player at that time. His house was bombed in the Clydebank Blitz, and he then played the next day and scored. And there was references about that in the match reports. There's a whole raft of things. There's the likes of Rudolf Hess crash landed, who was a Nazi leader at the time. He crash landed in a farmer's field in Scotland, and the Celtic support came up with a song about him, which they sang through the war. And then on the pitch, you've got players like Malcolm McDonald, Jimmy Delaney, Johnny Crum, the Frank Murphy. These are all big names in Celtic's history. And although Celtic had a pretty awful period during the war, they won a couple of trophies which are covered, but every game in the war period's covered. And you start to appreciate how good players like Jimmy Delaney are. And I know, David Potter, you've written a book as well before about Jimmy Delaney, so you'll already be aware of his talents and his achievements. So they say that World War II book, I hope to get completed in the summer. There's a lot more points that I've sort of unearthed, but you'll have to get the book to find out about those. But I'll just finish off. I'll come back to David Potter because you've got a book about Willie Fernie coming out as well. So tell us a bit more about that and when we can expect to see that.
Well, yes, Willie Fernie, I was actually rather amazed to discover that nobody had ever done a book about Willie Fernie. Yeah, not any great detail anyway, because he was actually a very, a great player and almost sort of equivalent of he was called occasionally Scotland's Stanley Matthews, because he was a dribbler, and he was a great player and of the type that you found quite a lot of in the 1950s. And also would like to answer the question you posed earlier, Liam. Why did a team had Willie Fernie and Charlie Tully, Bobby Collins, and all these people? Why did they not win more? And of course, the answer to that is, as we all know, bad management. Frankly, I don't think there's any other way of putting it. But Fernie had some tremendous games for the club. He played for Scotland now and again, never brilliantly for Scotland, but he did have a few good enough games for Scotland. And of course, he was the architect of the 7-1. I mean, that in itself, he played right half and he just controlled that game from start to finish, Willie Fernie. And very interesting character. He went to Middlesbrough. I've got a friend who's working with me, a man called John McHugh, who supported Middlesbrough at the time, and he remembered him well, playing alongside Brian Clough. And then, of course, Willie Fernie came back to Celtic, not with any great success for the club, I would have to say, but it was great to see him back. He was a great player, and I was very lucky in that I discovered that he had a sister who was still alive, and I went to see her, and she was lovely, and I've really enjoyed doing Willie Fernie, and I hope it's going to be a success.
Yeah, see, Willie Fernie as well played quite a key role in the Coronation Cup win. So pre-Lisbon, say scoring in the 7-1 game, and say being the architect behind that win, and then I think he set up both the goals in the Coronation Cup final. So that in itself should make him better known. So it's good that you're putting something together to get his story told and his full recognition.
Yeah. He only played in the Coronation Cup final because Charlie Tully was injured. He would have been the 12th man, but he did play because Charlie was injured, and of course he did a great part in that game as well. That's Willie Fernie, one of my father's favourites, and mine as well.
Right, and just to finish off, I'll go to David Folds to say when do you think the Willie Fernie book will be out, and what do you have any other plans for the Celtic Star library?
Well, the Willie Fernie book just finished. I'm just putting the finishing touches to it just now. It looks absolutely lovely. Like all the books, they're very high quality. In the past, these books would have been produced mostly by the mainstream media. And now they're getting produced to a higher standard by the Celtic support ourselves. And if you look through the historic library of Celtic books and look at the publishers, you'll see the people at the Daily Record have done a lot of them, etc. And now that's something that we've taken back. But the Willie Fernie book's out just before Easter, middle of April. And the next will be the World War II book, which once we've got it, then we'll take it from there a few months after that. And maybe do the Christmas, we're maybe looking at a player who played in the 80s, or maybe we could do the Strachan years, which is something that we're quite down the road on. We haven't finished it. Another book that I'd like to do is I haven't really, something floating around that if we could do the 30s versus the 50s, and we got, like David Potter arguing for the 50s and Matt Corr arguing for the 30s. Matt's done a lot of research on the 1930s, which I thought was fascinating. I thought it was a brilliant read. And these, I think a lot of these players in the 1930s would have been, lots happened. You think about David think of from John Thompson all the way, just all the way through. Then there's war women, when all this is going on. So I think that would be quite an interesting idea. And what that's doing as well is maybe if it would be too heavy to do a 1930s on its own, but if you do the two in that comparison, it might be a quite interesting way to do it. And which era would you have rather be supported Celtic in, kind of thing? Everybody's got their era, when you first sort of went to a game.
Well, I've got an embryonic idea of my own, which is in the same way as I think Matt did about the first year of Celtic's history. I was thinking of doing about the year 1965, which I'm going to call Celtic's Year of Revolution, because the start of 1965 was, of course, absolutely awful. On New Year's Day, Jimmy Johnson got sent off at Ibrox. Bobby Murdoch missed a penalty, and really we're going no place until end of January. Jock Stein came, and you couldn't say that it just changed overnight, but it did change. And it's a fascinating year, 1965, from being a very poor, underperforming team in January, that by August they had their own newspaper and had won 3 competitions in the year 1965, if you include the Glasgow Cup. And it's a fascinating year, that just the difference that a year makes. But that's just an embryonic idea of my own, which I'm playing about with at the moment, nothing else.
So it sounds like there's obviously plenty to come from the Celtic Star, and plenty available, as we've discussed as well. So I'll bring things to a close there, because just a bit conscious of time. You say if you enjoyed this show, make sure to like and subscribe, like the video and subscribe to the channel. We're looking to expand on the channel, so we've started off with some history features, which are usually sort of between 5 and 10 minutes long, little videos with a narration and some pictures or film footage. So that comes under the Celtic History podcast. We've got all the press conferences with the manager and the player before each game, and as well we're doing a bit of sort of news roundups. And now, say this is the first chat show, and we're looking to sort of add another few chat shows as we go along. So I think hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll get something together with the 4 of us to look at our greatest Celtic 11 pre-Lisbon, because the team that was voted for officially as the best 11 by the Celtic support didn't include anyone before Lisbon. And I'd read a post on the Celtic Noise forum with somebody suggested the idea. So we'll put together our 11s and discuss them, and then see if we can find any consensus on that. And if not, we might have to agree to disagree, as long as Jimmy Quinn's in the lineup.
Well, funnily enough, there's a problem with Jimmy Quinn, and that is he better than Jimmy McGrory? Gentlemen. Jimmy Quinn, at one point he played on the left wing, but never as well as he did in the centre forward. So that's a problem, that one. I'm worried about that one. We're losing sleep worrying about that one.
Well, see, we'll have to you have to come back and watch the second chat show to see how that debate goes. Might be an explicit one.
Cheers, Liam.
Right, thank you. Thanks everyone
Thank you very much, Liam. Thank you.
To chat, and you've enjoyed it.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.